I would like to welcome all the listeners and the viewers of the Coffee House Experience to our latest episode. In this episode, we'll focus on the ongoing conflict involving Russia and Ukraine. And given that we are caught currently in the fog of war, we'll focus mostly on the antecedents of the crisis because the final outcome is something that's everyone's guess right now. To discuss this issue with us, we have amidst us Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan. Professor Rajagopalan is a professor of international politics at JNU in New Delhi. Previously, he was a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation and a research fellow at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, both in Delhi. He has also served as Deputy Secretary at the National Security Council Secretariat of the Government of India, and in 2011 was the ICCR Visiting India Chair at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. His publications include the books Nuclear South Asia, Keywords and Concepts, Fighting Like a Guerrilla, The Indian Army and Counter-Insurgency, and Second Strike, Arguments about Nuclear War in South Asia. Welcome, Professor Rajagopalan.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So to start off, we can probably go to the very beginning. This is 1991. There's a coup where Mikhail Gorbachev is being displaced by Boris Yeltsin. The Soviet Union is disintegrating, and the first country to hold a referendum and leave the Soviet Union is Ukraine. What even George Bush Sr. envisaged at that point of time is that although USSR might not exist in its current avatar, it could exist as a looser confederacy of states. Even he could not envisage that USSR will break down into constituent states within a matter of months. So what are your views about that period, and how justified do you think are the Russian sense of anguish at how this entire thing happened?
Again, thank you for having me. I think that period is a rather complicated period in terms of internal Russian politics. It's a very complicated period in terms of the negotiations between not just the United States and the Soviet Russian leaders, but also between countries of Western Europe, Germany, because part of all of that leading up to that was the integration of East Germany into West Germany, and so on. So it's a very complicated period, but I think looking back at that period, the one thing that we can sort of say is that none of these leaders really had very much control over what happened. I mean, in a sense, it was things that were happening that were developing far faster than anybody could control. And so it was well beyond the machinations or even planning of any of these leaders. So, I mean, even if you go back to, in a sense, that is a problem that in a sense, if you say the Soviet collapse, that itself was a result of various problems that the Soviet Union faced, which was not intended. It was not intended that way. So when the Chinese, for example, look at what happened during the late 80s, they're going to take the lesson from that you shouldn't do this, which is that that you don't liberalize your polity before you liberalize your economy. But what we need to understand is that partly that was again a runaway process, because the reason Gorbachev was put in there was not so much to dismantle the Soviet Union, but to improve the Soviet economy and make it more efficient and so on and so forth. So, but once he started pulling at one thread, the whole thing collapsed. And in a sense, I think leaders did not really have much control over that process from the late 80s onwards. And so you had you had a sort of a developments that were piling upon each other, that were in a sort of I'm sorry for the mixed metaphors, but when a cascading effect of one thing after the other. And I think leaders in all of these countries were were trying to rush to figure out how to manage it. And of course, behind all of that was that great danger of nuclear weapons, right? I mean,
Right.
because there was no prior experience of a country with nuclear weapons collapsing in on itself. And so,
Right.
one of the great concerns that the West had was that what would happen. And you mentioned the coup against Gorbachev, and so that was another problem because you weren't sure who was in charge of those nuclear weapons. So, I mean, I think it was very chaotic. It was not as if anybody had control over that process. And I think so. I think it's very difficult to separate out any of these individual events from that overall chaos that was taking place in the former Soviet Union.
Right. So, a couple of questions on that thread. So, once you have Soviet Union breaking up and Russia essentially inheriting most of the Soviet apparatus and refashioning it to be Russian apparatus of sorts, you did have a new Ukrainian state, and for a very long time, it's well documented that Russia subsidized the energy bill, and they often had that similar. They had the same currency that they were using, and Russia imported inflation because Ukraine's management of the economy was far from perfect. So, do you
Mm.
think all those concerns that are voiced pretty frequently these days, where culturally, Russia considers Ukraine to be a part of the larger Russian whole, where Kiev rules is that original bloc from which they believe Russian and Ukrainian people emerged. Do you
Mm.
believe that that argument is valid, and also from the perspective of the fact that after USSR broke up, you did not have a Marshall Plan equivalent, right? Because that
Mm.
time US was going through a severe inflation. So, do you
Yeah.
think Russia is justified in having, say, the right of first refusal over Ukraine? Right.
Yeah. No, I mean, countries do have the right to join each other if they want. And we've had several cases, not very frequent, but we have had cases, including, of course, what I just mentioned, East Germany and West Germany joining together. And you had Syria and Egypt joining together in the Middle East and so on and so
Right.
forth. So there have been cases where countries have come together to form larger unions. But that has to be a voluntary process. I mean, it can't be a
Certainly.
process where you invade and occupy a country, right? I mean, and
Right.
so I think that is where the problem comes in. I mean, I think Ukraine had an independent status under the United Nations as an independent state. It was recognized. It is not even like, let's say, Tibet, which,
Right.
if you recall, the Chinese negotiations, historical negotiations between the British Empire and China and Tibet, the Chinese refused to recognize,
Hmm.
the status of Tibet and so on. So that it was not even that kind, right? I mean, it
Right.
was
Hmm.
it was well recognized, independent, autonomous state, legal, legitimate state, and it's not even like, for example, today Taiwan is
Right. Yeah.
very odd situation, which is that's an
Pretty unique.
independent in every which way. It is an independent state, but
Yep.
in legal terms, it is not a state, and so
Right.
so I mean, so it is states do have a right to come together. Countries do have a right to come together if they want to, but it can't be. You can't sort of invade somebody else and say that therefore now you are part of us because we have some historical claims.
Right.
Historical claims are a problem, of course, always. I mean, so that's
Always.
it's it's not easy to untangle those historical claims, right?
Yeah, but I mean, just want to add one thing about the ethnic tension, right? So there is
Yeah,
this, eastern region, in fact, Crimea as well, where there is significant ethnic Russian population, and
yeah,
it's like there are claims that sort of Western powers, they claim that it's sort of kind of contrived, but on the other hand, Russia claims that the people actually want, more,
mm,
they're more pro-Russia in that sense. So there is
yeah.
always this ethnic tension, right? So that kind of
Mhm.
makes it hard to sort of make a case for at least like make 100% case for, like, even if Ukraine is a sovereign state or something. What about
Mhm.
this ethnic like fundamentally ethnic Russian parts?
Yeah.
What do you think? Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a very complicated problem when you have these kinds of cases where there are ethnic minorities and there are claims from other states that because there are ethnic are ethnic minorities in somebody else's territory. Therefore, that territory belongs to us. I mean, this was the logic, of course, of Hitler claiming ethnic minorities in
Exactly.
various
Right.
parts
Yep.
of
Yep.
Europe, and therefore he has a right to those territories. I'm not saying this is the same as Hitler's claims, but
Right.
the problem is that it's very, very difficult to adjudicate these sorts of arguments, and it becomes the same claims are made, of course, with regard to South Asia, for example, Kashmir, same sort of claims because
Kind of. Yeah.
Kashmiris are predominantly Muslim, and therefore they should join Pakistan.
Pakistan.
The problem with these kinds of claims is, how do we know, right? I mean, we don't
Hmm.
have any way of knowing what the desires of ethnic minorities in various parts are. That's one part of the problem. Right? I mean, Russia can claim that these are Russian ethnic minorities, and therefore we should have control over them, or they should join us. But that doesn't mean that that ethnic minority necessarily wants to join Russia. So that figuring that out itself is one problem. The second problem is that once you start opening up these kinds of questions about who has the right to live where and so on, um, you are opening up a Pandora's box. It doesn't stop. I mean, where do we stop that kind of where do we, if every minority has a right to live wherever they want to live, then it becomes, and without any without uh, without uh, given the established borders. I mean, without the
Yeah.
reference to the established borders. While I have sympathy for those kinds of claims, it becomes the consequences of that
Hmm.
would be enormously damaging for everybody,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so it becomes
Including them, including the ethnic
including them,
minorities, of
including
course. Yeah.
them. But also there could be minorities within those minorities. So what do we do about
Of
that,
course. Yeah.
right? I mean, if there are minorities within that eastern part who don't want to be part of
Sure.
Russia, then why should their rights be any less important than the rights of the majority of that part? Even assuming that they want to join Russia, which itself is not very clear, right? I mean, so I think these are very complicated questions, but once you start opening up established national boundaries on the basis of these kinds of questions, on
Hmm.
the basis of these sorts of claims about ethnic nationalities, then we are in a whole new ball game, and every border could be potentially be opened up to these
Basically.
kinds of
Basically.
questions. Yeah, and so because Russia itself, obviously, from the 15th century onwards, expanded eastwards. I mean, this is Siberia and most of Central Asia and so on were not originally part of
Hmm.
the Russian state, and so we could start questioning those claims, as Chinese have, for example, already questioned
Right.
Russia's control over Vladivostok and stuff like that. So this is these kinds of arguments are very problematic, and as I think it was the Kenyan representative in the UNSC mentioned in the during the vote on the UN Security Council vote, explanation of vote. We said, this is we can't. Once you open up these questions, all of our borders have to be open,
Right.
and we can't. And one of the things that African countries decided when they were decolonized was that we will not open up these questions because
Hmm.
obviously, if you look at the map of Africa, it's all
Right.
straight lines. I mean, obviously, it's not ethnic communities
Zillions of,
don't.
yeah,
Yeah,
zillions of ethnicity.
yeah. I mean, so it's a complete mess. And the colonial powers drew these maps for their convenience, and so they are state lines.
Of
But of
course.
course, communities are not. They're spread across these borders, and so if they opened up one border, they'll have to open up every border. And so they said,
Right.
this is what we got, and let's not open this up. And I think that is probably a safer approach, especially given that these are recognized borders. I mean, Russia hasn't questioned the borders,
Disputed. Yeah.
existing borders, right? I
Right.
mean, it's
Right.
not like India and China or India and
Right.
Pakistan where the
Right.
borders are, where there is question about the borders. But these are established borders. And so then it becomes a problem. I think we can still have raised questions about the treatment of minorities, and I think that's a legitimate question to raise. So,
Right.
if there are Russian minorities within Ukraine, their treatment can be a legitimate question for international discourse, for other countries. I mean, they can say that you have to treat these minorities with certain, that they have to be given certain rights and so on, and you can't oppress them. And that is, I think, legitimate. But you can't say because they are minorities and we share the same language or something, and
Mm.
therefore we are, they belong to us. I mean, so that I think is going too far.
Right. And also, like, there is this neo-Nazi sort of uprising in like certain parts of Ukraine, right? So it kind
Yeah,
of associated with this, ethnicity question as well, right?
yeah, yeah. So that is, but that is that there are these groups, but this is one of the things that we have seen in the last 10 years or so is the rise of neo-Nazi groups
across the
in the
world.
variety across Europe. I mean,
Yes.
across Europe, including particularly in Russia. I mean,
Yeah,
it's not
particularly in
even,
the Eastern
so
Europe. Yeah, yeah.
in Eastern Europe and in Russia, it was in particular. I mean, so that is, so it becomes, so this is a general problem. This is nothing to do specifically with Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine is governed by a Jewish president. So it's
Right.
not as if the regime is Nazi itself. I mean,
Of
so there
course.
is,
Yeah.
so that, that is problematic. And again, even if that were the case, I think that is a legitimate question that can be raised if you say you are engaging in behavior um, that the government or a state is engaging in behavior that is unacceptable towards its own citizens, right? I mean, that is a question that can be raised, even though I would point out that countries like Russia, India, China, and most of the third world are very resistant to anybody else raising questions about the treatment, about how the state treats its own citizens, right? I mean, so we
Right.
are extremely, so R2P, the responsibility to protect, and notions like that are extremely looked at with great suspicion
Mm.
by all of these countries. But nevertheless, it is, one could go to the extent of saying that, okay, those are legitimate questions. But as an excuse for invasion,
Yeah.
I don't
Exactly.
think they are anywhere near
Right.
credible.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Let's circle back to the past where it all began. So, till 1989, you had a set of Warsaw Pact countries,
Yeah.
with East Germany falling under the purview of the Warsaw Pact, and with NATO covering all the countries West Germany onwards to the west, right? So, after 1989, where literally Mikhail Gorbachev was compelled to take whatever he got. Simply put, for
Mm.
lack of a better
Yeah.
term, he took whatever he got, and
Mm.
he could not get any definitive guarantees on a limit on how the NATO would expand eastwards, and the Warsaw Pact became null and void. Right? So,
Yeah.
uh, do you think this is inevitable? Because after 1991, there have been 5 tranches where the NATO has expanded, with the latest ones coming in 2017 and 2020 with Montenegro and North Macedonia. So, do you
Yeah.
think a skirmish was inevitable? It might not have taken the form of a full-fledged war, but a severe geopolitical crisis, was it inevitable?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a very difficult question that we have had. I mean, the last 2, 3 weeks, we had a
Right,
huge debate going on because some American scholars have made that argument. Mearsheimer was prominent, John Mearsheimer,
right.
political scientist from the University of Chicago, most prominently, and others have refuted that argument for a variety of reasons. But let me sort of, to take that argument, to begin to take a look at that, what that argument is. The argument is basically that Russia deserved a sort of, I mean, Russia, like all great powers, uh, wanted a sphere of influence so that other great powers do not come close to it. And if your other great powers come close to it, then its security potentially could be threatened, and therefore it shouldn't. That others had to be careful about how close they want to push their security borders, as it were, to Russia's borders. I mean, so the spreading of NATO, as it were, I mean, almost all the former Warsaw Pact countries are now I think all of them are now in NATO,
NATO. Right.
along with some of the former Soviet republics, especially the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are
Estonia.
also in the
Right.
in NATO. Now, the problem, of course, this is not a this is a a principle of pragmatism, right? This is not an international legal principle that you can't push your border to
Sure,
that you can't push an alliance
sure,
to
sure.
somebody else's. So as a pragmatic principle is what Mia Sharman and others have argued that pushing NATO eastwards is naturally increased Russian insecurity,
Yeah.
and therefore, as a consequence, Russia is reacting. Um, it is I'm not entirely convinced of that argument because for one thing, it wasn't NATO that pushed itself eastward, right? I mean, it was basically these
The
countries,
countries, yeah.
the smaller countries um, bordering on Russia that had historically been repeatedly attacked and conquered and subjugated by Russia that wanted protection from Russia, right? I mean, these were countries that had long experience of Russian imperialism, and now that they had a chance to escape that, they wanted Western protection. This is what Donald Rumsfeld, the former defense secretary, is called the New Europe versus the Old Europe. So the New Europe were countries that were keen to join the European Union, keen to join NATO, keen to have American security guarantees and so on because of their own historical experience, right? I mean, and so it found now the counter argument to that is to say that okay, even if those countries wanted it, why did the U.S. and NATO permit themselves to be to take these countries as members of NATO, considering that doing that was something that Russia had always opposed. Russia had always been concerned about that. So there is a pragmatic case to be made that pushing that, allowing this, not pushing, pushing is wrong word because it wasn't that NATO pushed itself eastward. It was these
Right.
countries joining NATO. I think so. Allowing these countries to join NATO, therefore, was not pragmatic. I mean, maybe that was probably the best argument that could be made because it increased Russian insecurities. And as a consequence of increased Russian insecurities, led to partly to this crisis. The counterpoint to that argument is a number of other scholars have pointed out that Russia wasn't as much concerned about the NATO membership to these countries. It was that Russia was primarily interested in having a say in Europe as a whole, and so NATO, Russia originally wanted US and Russia, or maybe with Germany included, the great powers, as it were, to jointly manage Europe. Right? It was that which Russia wanted. Not it wasn't concerned about NATO or whatever else, but
Mm.
even though it was put in those terms, but nevertheless, it was primarily concerned about a joint management. Now, that joint management became difficult, partly because, of course, there was the US could have been better, could have managed that better, that particular problem better, given Russia, a bit more bow, as it were, I mean, bit
Mm.
more status and so on. But the fact was that Russia was a state that had nothing but nuclear weapons. Outside of that, it really did not have anything. Today, its GDP is what $1.5 trillion.
Right.
It's half of India's, right? I mean, it's
Right.
not really a great power. So it became, I think, one could make an argument that the US and the West could have behaved a bit better, given them a little bit more credit. But ultimately, um, there is nothing that could have been done to paper over the fact of Russia's weakness, right? I mean, there was only so much that anybody could have done to 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 indicate that okay, Russia, you're an important player and so on and so forth. That is the whole argument about multipolarity. I mean, we can in India also we keep talking about multipolarity, and the problem is multipolarity is a term that denotes a particular kind of balance of power, right? The sense that it suggests that you have four or five great powers. The problem is that great powers are, how you decide how four or five great powers is based not on how loudly you shout,
Mm.
but on how much wealth and power you have, actual wealth and power you have. And by that criteria, the world is not multipolar. I mean, the world for the last 30 years, since
Yes, it is one
1991, has
superpower.
been unipolar. It has
Unipolar.
been dominated by the United States,
US.
and
Yeah.
now
Probably it's
maybe
bipolar.
bipolar because it's China. It's not multipolar, so it can't sort of we can't wish up, a balance of power or anything like that. I mean, this is
Yeah.
the nature of this is the way the world is, and unfortunately, if Russia is unwilling to accept the fact that it is a weak state.
Hmm.
It has nuclear weapons, but it's still, it has half its GDP is about South Korea's, right? I mean,
Right.
so that matters. I mean, it's others can sort of put you in the major councils of the world and so on, but
Right.
it's ultimately your weakness does matter, and so there isn't anything that anybody can do about it. And Russia, unfortunately, has never been able to come to terms with it, and so that really is a problem. And there is no way that anybody can do anything about that particular problem unless Russia eventually becomes strong enough. And I mean that is where the real issue is.
So the whole insecurity, like we're back to the whole insecurity point, right?
Yeah,
Like
it's
I'm basically weak, but I'm sort of, I'm fine as long as I'm perceived as strong. But how do I prove that?
yeah,
Just to this military power, right? Yeah.
yeah. So I mean the problem is that if you Russia has been a great power, and if it resolves some of its internal problems, it will again be a great power because it's a huge country. It has enormous amount of resources,
Right.
but and it's been in the ranks of European great powers for the last several hundred years, and it will continue to be in those ranks because of the potential that it has, right? I mean, it's not just because currently it is in a bad shape doesn't mean it doesn't have that potential. But that doesn't mean that everybody is going to treat you the same as you were when you were one of the great powers, right? I mean, when you were truly a very powerful state. Uh, Russia no longer is, and so but coming to terms with that is somewhat difficult for Russia. So that unfortunately there is nothing much that anybody can do about that part.
There's also constant US effort to sort of, reducing the power of Russia throughout the whole Cold War period. And probably they haven't succeeded. And, so in this conflict, of course, like Russia is like, how much do you think like the Western Bloc is somehow, is there any way they could somehow avoid, like you say already mentioned this, like they do not accept the application to NATO for all these, countries. Apart from that, like economically sanctioned or otherwise, if they could have avoided, like if there is any accountability towards the West for this kind of situation.
And even before this ongoing crisis, if you could probably expand on what your views are on whether US had any role in precipitating the multiple colored revolutions that happened in
Mm,
Ukraine, Georgia in the mid
Basically,
2000s, the
yeah.
Euromaidan revolt that started in 2013
Mm,
on, which ultimately culminated in the annexation of Crimea. Yeah.
right, right, yeah. So I mean, it is. I'm sure there were. The U.S. was at least intellectually and emotionally supportive of those kinds of movement because it's understandable that it would be because it is a democracy and it would support just as it supported, for example, the student rebellion in Tiananmen Square. Uh, but whether there was some kind of a plot, that is not clear to me. I mean, it's not. I think it's very, very difficult for governments to create those kinds of movements. Those kinds of movements are extremely difficult to create, and it usually takes a certain moment of time in a particular historical epoch that these all of these forces come together to desperation and hopelessness. All of that come together in order to create periods when you could possibly have that sufficient spark to create, that sort of. I don't think foreign governments or even domestic governments have that kind of capacity to anticipate it or create those kinds of moments. I mean, they can potentially um, fund some things, but that is not going to create the kind of mass popular support that we saw for those kinds of the Maidan moments and the color revolutions. So I'm skeptical of that because governments have tried throughout history, or even the last 100 years, during the Cold War period. Many governments have tried to do that kind of thing on both sides, try to create those kinds of moments, but they haven't succeeded. I mean, so it's not easy to create these kinds of moments from outside, which is one reason why I'm also quite skeptical of American claims about Soviet interference in the 2016 elections and so on.
Elections.
Mm.
Not that the Soviets didn't try, but I'm sorry, Russians didn't try, but the idea that some kid sitting in Moscow or somewhere else can manipulate elections in Minnesota or wherever, when there are political operators who spend all their life in those places and can't do it. I mean, it just seems to me to be ridiculous and absurd. So these things are very, very difficult. I mean, it's not, we have an exaggerated sense of how these kinds of the effectiveness of these kinds of supposedly covert operations, where there was a US support, was the US and the West supportive of these efforts? Of course they were. I mean, there's no question about it. But where did they engineer it? No, no chance. I mean, I'm not. I wouldn't say no chance. I'm extremely skeptical. I mean, if that is giving the US and its agencies enormous amount of control.
Right.
If they had that kind of control, they could do a hell of a lot more, right? I mean, so they haven't really done that. So I'm very skeptical of those sorts of the idea that the US engineered it. If they may have supported it once it began, and that is perfectly that I find perfectly reasonable. So I'm not. So I don't have I'm not sure. I mean, that part, of course, I can understand that in Moscow, it might not have looked that way, and that it might have been seen as an effort by the United States to overthrow governments that are friendly to Russia and so on. But and that might have added to their insecurity. So that kind of what might be called regime insecurity, that is insecurity of their own governments. I mean, I think also was also one of the reasons why Russia reacted the way it has, and part of the reason for the overall Russian insecurity. But these are not things that I'm not sure that anybody outside could have done very much about these kinds of insecurities, because that is the nature of your regime. Your regime is based on a very narrow social base. It is not particularly democratic. It is stays in power through threats and coercion and intimidation, and you naturally would fear people, right? I mean, and so then in that context, I'm not sure that there is anything that anybody else can do to satisfy your insecurity, right? I mean, to
Mm.
ameliorate or reduce your insecurity, because you're always afraid.
Mm.
And I mean that, but I can understand that fear, but it is not anything that anybody else from outside could have done to reduce that fear.
Right. So, in parallel with the ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia, which is fought palpably on the ground, you have a war of memories between Ukraine and Russia, wherein certain characters which are very, very antithetical to what Russia stood for during the Second and the First World War are Ukrainian heroes. For example, someone like, say, a Stephen Bandera, who was literally a Holocaust participant and who was associated or affiliated with the Nazis. He is seen as a key Ukrainian hero, and even during the Second World War, they only consider the Ukrainian national forces to be the true representatives of Ukraine, and they consider the entire period of communism under Russia or the wider USSR umbrella to be just a minor gap on their progress towards the correct arc of history, to speak of sorts, right? So, how do you consider this in terms of feeding the resentment that Russians bear towards Ukraine and vice versa? It's something like, say, in India, a Subhash Chandra Bose would have in terms of a contentious history. He
Yeah,
stood for Indian independence, but he did definitely partake in some tallying with both
yeah,
Mussolini as well as Hitler. So, yeah.
yeah. I mean, I think we all have bad histories. We all of these countries have a history of anti-Semitism, very, very deeply implicated all of the Central European and Eastern European states, in Europe in general, of course, but I
Hmm.
mean, particularly in Central Europe and Eastern Europe. Russia is, I mean, Russia is no stranger to that either. So, and of course, so the pre-Second World War and the Second World War history of most of these countries are also quite horrific in many ways, because um, uh, since many of these countries had already been colonized from the east by Russia, by the Soviet Union, by Stalin, they had suffered under Stalin. So many of them sort of took whatever anti-Stalin, whatever the opposite was, which was the Nazis. So they're not, neither of them are exactly um, people that or movements or social groups that today we would consider to be within the pale. I mean, so they are, so they, I mean, but the problem is that all of them, all of those histories, we can find plenty of examples, right? I mean, this is not new. This is not, within the context of a conflict, I can understand that both Russia and Ukraine might come up with figures that would reinforce their notion of separateness, or reinforce their notions of being different, or alternative in the Russian case of evilness of the Ukrainians. And I think, I mean, obviously, with all of history, with in whichever country we're looking at, we will have to. It becomes very difficult to judge these things, right? Because we all have, looking at it from the perspective of today's morality and today's ethics, it's very difficult,
Very
and
difficult, yeah.
we have to have a very complicated sort of, these are complicated histories for all of us, and that doesn't necessarily implicate the present, right? I mean, that is, I think, the key point, that we have to, the fact that we have these memories, or that the fact that we have these historical figures, does not indicate necessarily your program today or what you plan to do today. And I think it is that which necessarily have to be the basis of any judgment. Right? I mean, what are you doing today should be the basis of judgment, rather than what these historical figures that you're using today, what did they indicate? And as you correctly pointed out with Subhashchandra Bose, these are a lot of Americans, a lot of Westerners, who are not familiar with Subhashchandra Bose,
Hmm.
recoil in horror
Right.
at some of these things, and we can, even those who are, I mean, those who should know better, and this is that those who are South Asianists and who are studied India don't really fully seem to understand the place that he has in our memories and in our mythologies and so on. So I think that is a problem. I mean, I think that that is not. I mean, we can't sort of find again a middle ground there, but they'll just simply have to understand that, others will simply have to understand the place that these kind of historical figures have within the very narrow constraints of our memories and our, or of the particular country, whichever one, Ukraine or Russia, whatever. But it's not the same as a larger historical moment. I mean, it's something very different, and so that's, I think, that's an issue that, with Ukraine and Russia again, I think these are things that we need to be very careful about. I mean, I don't think we can again pass judgments on either side on that, in that way.
So, coming to the mid 90s, what are your views on the Budapest Memorandum, where this was key to Ukraine giving up a number of the nuclear warheads that were located on its
Mm.
surface after the USSR broke out? And uh, so, yeah, what do you think does
Yeah,
nuclear power have to play? What kind of role does it have to play in the current conflict? Right?
yeah. The John Mearsheimer that we talked about earlier, the Chicago political science professor, who is on record at that time writing that saying that Ukraine should keep its nuclear weapons. Of course, a lot of people citing him today don't remember that part of it. So, anyway, the point is that I would have agreed with Mearsheimer of that point that Ukraine should have kept its nuclear weapons because ultimately Ukraine faced an existential threat. It faced an existential threat then, and it faced an existential threat today. And nuclear weapons are the perfect weapons to ensure your defense against that particular kind of threat, which is existential threats. In other words, threats where your very existence is threatened, right? I mean, and so you have a Pakistan, you have Israel, you have Taiwan, even though Taiwan doesn't have nuclear weapons, but these are countries that perceive, irrespective of whether you agree with their perception or not, perceive that their very existence is threatened, which is different from countries like India or China, which don't perceive that, or we don't perceive our existence is threatened. I mean, nuclear weapons are there because others have nuclear weapons, and the only way to deter others from using nuclear weapons against us
Against
is to
us.
threaten to use against them. But we don't perceive that somebody can attack us and end our existence. I mean, we don't face an existential threat, but some countries do, like Israel does. Pakistan, agree with it or not, they feel that existential threat. Iran, sorry, Taiwan does today, and Ukraine did, right? I mean, and so for countries like that, nuclear weapons are the perfect means of resistance, perfect means of defense. Now, the argument that is used today is that, well, Ukraine was economically weak at that point of time, needed a lot of
Exactly.
Western aid, and yeah, and it couldn't have possibly used these weapons because the launch codes and things
Also,
like that
Yeah.
were all in Russian hands.
Yes.
I'm not sure because, well, launch codes may have been, but these are Russia. Ukraine had a lot of defense industries, many other manufacturing factories, and so on. Wherein Ukraine, many other armories were in Ukraine. Because obviously, because it was not sort of a separate country, it was part of the Soviet Union, and so they had all of these. So obviously there was enough technical capacity in Ukraine to have, if they had kept their nuclear weapons, to have reverse engineered this or to have figured out how to use them. The problem is that at that particular point in time, um, it's there's a little. I guess there is not a whole lot to be said at this stage as to whether they should have kept it or not. The fact is that they gave up. They made a choice. They gave up just like Taiwan gave up and made a choice. I mean, Taiwan was also in the late 70s um, uh, building nuclear weapons or researching on building nuclear weapons, and the U.S. found out about it, and the U.S. basically shut it down under the threat of withdrawal of all U.S. support for conventional and economic in conventional military and economic support that the US was giving to them. So again, Taiwan made a choice that its relationship with the United States and the protection that the United States was giving it without nuclear weapons was sufficient or more important than the nuclear weapons that they could have had. And Ukraine made the same choice. I think they made the wrong choice, but that's a choice they made, and so I do think that they could have used those weapons. I would have agreed with Mearsheimer of those days when he said they should have kept those weapons instead of giving up those weapons.
Right.
But a lot of people who work on nuclear weapons and so on argue that they could not have and that they were right not to give. I would disagree with them, but that is where the argument is. And in any case, at this stage, obviously, it's not, it's a bit late in the day, obviously. That is, they gave it up, and we are where we are. So,
yeah, a follow up about is like, there are existential threats real, and there are like perceptions which are sometimes
yeah.
manufactured by the politicians that we need
hmm
nuclear weapons,
hmm
whatever. We might like die of hunger, but we still need nuclear weapons. So how do you
Yeah.
distinguish them? And it's like
Yeah.
it's kind of this pro gun sentiment in the like several confederate states in America, where it says that we need guns because we are under threat. So how do
Yeah.
you sort of reconcile with these kind of things?
Yeah. I mean, there is no way that anybody outside can judge that, right? I mean, we can say, for example, that Pakistan faces no existential threat from India. and there is no reason why they should have wasted so much of their national wealth and treasure on pursuing nuclear weapons, not only just in terms of the dollar amounts, but also in terms of the other associated costs in terms of sanctions, in terms of relationships and whatnot that they suffered. So it is possible to make that argument from the outside, but ultimately every country, the leaders of all countries have to decide for themselves what matters to them. And Pakistan decided very clearly after 71 war, after 71 December 71 Bangladesh war, they decided that they needed to have nuclear weapons because India's um, conventional military power was so great that India could potentially invade and swallow them up. Right? I mean, that was no Indian since the 1947 in positions of power has ever said that or done that or never been a plan about that. I mean, our plans have always been defensive.
Right.
But from the perspective of Pakistan, if you are sitting next to a country like India, which is about 7 times your size,
Mm.
right? 7 times your wealth, 7 times your population, or 10 times your population, and so on. There is always that nagging fear, right? I mean, and especially considering history and things like that. And so I don't know whether we can, from the outside, judge whether somebody's perception is valid or not. It is entirely between the leaders of a country and the people who put them there and the citizens and so on, who whether those are the right choices they have to make. I'm a bit I can we can make an intellectual argument about why that is not why their perceptions are overblown. But can we say that for all times? I don't know whether we can say that for all times, right? I mean, and so Israel, despite strong American support, decided that no, we will, it doesn't matter how much the US supports us, we will have to have our own means of survival. And so, despite American opposition, they went ahead and built their own nuclear weapons. So, these are choices, sometimes difficult choices that states have to make. But I can understand their choices. I mean, I'm not going to begrudge them that the choices that they make. I don't think from the outside we can say that they shouldn't make those choices.
So I would request you to do some crystal balling now. I know we are
Okay.
in the mid of a war, but I would just love it if I could get your views on this. So, what would the end game of this be? Would this be something like, say, Russian intervention in or USSR intervention in 56 Hungary or 68 Czechoslovakia? Or would this end up in something like, say, 1971, where you had an East Pakistan and a West Pakistan, and you ended up cleaving the country into two halves with Indian intervention there? It's
Yeah,
kind
I
of a
yeah.
foregone conclusion that probably Russia looks to win at the end, because Russia is militarily much, much stronger than Ukraine. It's not a fair match of sorts. So, yes, your views on this.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, at this stage, now 10 days in, things are looking a lot more hazy than it was the first couple of days because at the beginning of the war, I think most people assumed that Russia would simply crush
Yeah.
Ukraine, and that clearly hasn't happened.
Right.
We didn't realize how bad the Russian military mission was, or maybe it was just bad planning. I mean, you could have the best military mission, and if you mess up the planning, you could still end up in a very, really, really bad place. And it's not very clear at this stage whether the Russian problem was with the Russian military mission itself or the manner in which it was used. Either ways, we are where we are 10 days in, and Russia hasn't made a whole lot of progress. And it is finding that the going is very, very difficult. And we tend to forget because we tend to put Ukraine next to Russia, and Russia is a huge country. And it's not something like when we think of Pakistan we tend to think of as a small country, which is
Mm.
not.
This is not.
But because it's next to India, it seems like a small country. And Ukraine, similarly, is a fairly large country, one of the largest countries in Europe, and except for Russia, of course. And so occupying such a large country with such a highly nationalistic people is going to be extremely difficult. So I think it is, and the amount of stubborn resistance that the Ukrainian military and popular and at the popular level that the Russians are facing, I'm not even sure at this stage that Russia would win this. I mean, and I think ideally at this stage, maybe Russia calls it a truce and gets what they can. We get what
Yeah.
they can. Find some sort of a way to withdraw without hurting themselves much more than they already have.
Would that
Then, of
mean,
course,
say,
yeah.
independence for Donetsk and Luhansk, basically the Donbas region?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, those are the problems in the sense that, the question is what will they be willing to settle for? I think at this
Mm.
stage, if the eastern parts and plus Crimea, if they if they want to just take that, I think Ukraine might possibly say, fine. I mean,
Mm.
we
Exactly.
will uh, settle that as where the borders were as of what February 17th, whatever the date was. I'm forgetting the date now, but
Mhm.
um, whatever that, we'll keep that as a formal border, whatever it can take. I'm assuming that Ukraine will ask for the right of the citizens there to come to Ukraine, western part of Ukraine, outside of that. But so this is it's difficult to say how where this will go, but it's also difficult to figure out what I mean, what the end game here is for Putin because he's basically finding himself in an extremely bad place. He's the sanctions are horrific. What Russia is facing, and their stock market hasn't opened up and doesn't look like it'll open up in the near future.
Yeah, sure.
So that's your area. I mean, you will have to tell us more about that part. But the point is, there isn't a whole lot that China can do, even assuming China is willing to help. Or everybody else is rapidly finding ways to cut their links with the Russian economy, because part of the enormous power that the United States has is that even the uncertainty about whether you have, it may be that some areas, I was just hearing earlier today that most Indian most Indian broadcasters have taken RT, the Russia Today channel, off their,
They have, right?
Airtel and whatnot have taken it off the
Right.
air. I don't think they took it off the air because Americans asked for that, but because nobody knows whether they are crossing some American lines, right? I mean, we don't know whether if you do that, if you may not be intending to, but you may, uh, without knowing, you may be crossing some American law, and the consequences of that are too great. The costs of that are too great for private companies and
Mm.
private entities to risk. And so everybody's cutting themselves off from Russia. So I think it's the costs are mounting, and we don't know. We don't even know what the exact costs are for Russia because it is so horrendous that there are already people suggesting that Russia will not be able to pay its salaries next month to its state employees, to the military, whatnot, and it's potentially catastrophic. So we don't know. I mean, we don't know the exact outlines of how bad this is for Russia, but it could be potentially quite bad. And so therefore, Putin, if he's getting sensible information, which again is a question, we don't know whether what sort of information he has. It is quite likely that he would, pragmatically speaking, that he cuts his losses and withdraws and says, declares victory and sort of, goes back and takes what he can get as far as Crimea goes and the Russian-speaking provinces, Donetsk and so on. So I that would be ideal. I think at this stage that I think even the Ukrainians might accept that. I mean, it's difficult to say, but I also don't see how Russian military is much larger, and it is it could grind down the Ukrainians, but so far they haven't done that, and
Yeah.
so it's they are not don't seem to be able to do that, and their military size alone is not, especially given the massive Western assistance going into Ukraine in anti-tank, anti-aircraft weapons, and so on. So I don't know whether the Russians at this stage it's even possible for Russians to entirely or even capture Kiev, forget all of Ukraine, but even capture Kiev. So there is already talk of them pulling back forces from Syria and Georgia and so on. So it's central, a place in Africa. So it seems like Russia might not even have the capacity to successfully complete this. In which case, it is going to be quite a serious. I think, pragmatically speaking, they should. Putin could uh, declare victory and find a way to go home. I mean, I think that would be, that potential deal is that. I mean, keep what you already had and leave the rest aside.
Right. One thing, actually, I think the context of 1971 came up a few times. And so, I mean, in Twitter, there are all sorts of like tweets, like comparing these two sort of, like pro-Russian support, saying that, this is just like recovering like India supported Bangladesh movement. So, I mean, we know that sort of there are like arguments to make against this, but I just want to hear what you have to say, that why these two things are completely different.
No, there is no comparison. We had huge numbers of millions of refugees flowing into our country. There was no doubt on that score. I mean, there is, there was genocide
Exactly.
happening right next door. We had to go in because of that genocide that couldn't be stopped. Despite our best efforts, and so we unfortunately that is not the same situation that we have in Ukraine and Russia. I mean, that is completely different sort of
Although
situation.
Putin actually he claimed some genocides.
Yeah, I mean, there is the from what we see, people from Donetsk and the other regions are fleeing westward, not eastward.
Right.
Right. I mean, they are fleeing
That's very
away
crucial.
from
That's
Russia.
very crucial. Yeah.
Yeah. So that doesn't suggest that there is any. That doesn't suggest that there is any kind of um, why would they flee towards the source of danger if that is what is claiming, right? I mean,
Exactly.
so I don't think that is valid, and moreover, there was global support, not at the government level, but at the popular level. There was global support for Bangladesh. I mean, there were concerts being held, and
Right.
there was popular support across Europe, across the United States
But although
for
not from the US government, though. I mean, US
not from
government
the
was.
government. I mean, the U.S. But even within the U.S. government, we know that except for Nixon and Kissinger and their
Right.
close some of the people around them, the rest of the U.S. government was very opposed to what the U.S. was doing. Right? I mean, the famous blood telegram, the entire State Department within the United States was
Right.
all very, very opposed to, and they were leaking information, of course, to the New York Times and so on.
Right.
So there was very clearly a very different sort of, even the U.S. government was isolated on that question. Right? I mean, so
Exactly.
it
Exactly.
was not the U.S. State Department was not on board. Congress was not on board.
Right.
Much of the U.S. popular media, Hollywood, all of them were
Right.
against it. The media, the press, TV, everybody was against it. So it's a very different situation. I mean, I don't think it's even
Yeah.
comparable to
Exactly. Yeah. Just to put on a record.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
What are the chances, sir, that you feel this could end up with Putin being deposed from office? Like there are several Western commentators who give an inkling that this could be a possibility, but we have seen historically that even when a country faces severe
Yeah.
sanctions, like say a Venezuela or an Iran, their leaders get empowered more. They don't usually get deposed. And Russia is in the worst of worst states, right? Because
Yeah. Yeah.
out of its
Yeah.
of dollar and gold reserves. 2/3 it just can't access because of sanctions.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
Many banks can't access SWIFT, which is their messaging system for global
Yeah.
payments. They have to depend on China. That's the only way they can probably escape this conundrum. So, what are your views?
Yeah, China also, I'm not sure. Like I said, China is very pragmatic. I don't know that they want to get on the wrong side of the United States, and they need the US financial institutions also. No, these are things that we can't really say, right? We don't know the what Putin's staying power is from uh, what comes out in terms of Putin's relationship with his coterie is all based on hearsay. And so even the best of criminologists and um, Putin watchers can't say for sure what would be the effect of these. I mean, on the one hand, I've seen very well established Russia experts. I'm not a Russia expert, but well established Russia experts saying that there's no chance that it is not going to happen because Putin controls all the levers of power and everybody else depends on him. So they can't really do anything without him. Others point to the possibility that, as you suggested, that the damage is so great that he's doing that they would all get together and they cause certainly some of them could get together and overthrow him. Um, it's from the outside, it is impossible to tell. I think it is. These are possibilities, especially given the state that of Russia is in, especially in the coming weeks. It's going to be get worse and worse. So, is that a possibility? Maybe. It's definitely among the range of possibilities, but probability wise, it's very, very difficult to say. I don't think even the best criminologists can say probability, what the probability of something like that happening is. So I wouldn't even, I wouldn't want to hazard a bit. We would just be, it's just guessing game, right? I mean,
Right.
we don't have any basis for those kinds of guessing games, other than the fact that he's, that he is. But whether others will use that as a way to depose him, we don't know. That's very difficult to say.
Probably the only time this happened was Lavrenti Beria getting replaced by Nikita Khrushchev. So that's one
Yeah, but
one-off
yeah,
example
yeah, yeah,
in
yeah,
history.
yeah.
One-off example. So now
That
let's
is very that he was not supreme
fair
like
enough.
Putin.
That was
That
different.
is
There was a
not.
party
Putin has
structure and
had
so on.
yeah, exactly. Putin has had 20 years
Right.
plus
Right.
to
Yeah, it's
solidify
kind
his
of
control.
already like becoming a Stalin in some sense.
Yeah.
Right.
And Srinjoy, I mean, he was saying that what's the possibility of something good happening? I mean, I have like some other
Of what?
direction.
Sorry.
No, I mean, he was asking like, what's the possibility of Putin getting off the chair or something?
Yeah.
So I have the other extreme. Like, what do you think? Like the possibility of escalating to like I don't know nuclear war or something, with especially
Yeah.
Russia like targeting the this nuclear plants and so on.
Yeah, I don't see that as very likely either. I mean, I am I generally tend to be optimistic on nuclear issues,
Hmm.
in the sense that I think leaders are fairly sensible, and Putin doesn't have a single button that he can push to send nuclear weapons. That's not how it works. I mean, it's the nuclear command and control in every country is very, very complex and complicated, and it's designed precisely not to
Hmm.
let one person. Actually, the most direct thing is in the U.S., where the president almost on his own
Basically, yeah.
can go to nuclear war, but in every other country, it is a little bit more complicated than that, and so there are several layers of protection. And but I don't think even Putin or anybody else, for that matter, is nuts enough to sort of think that
Hmm.
they will that that they could go to nuclear war. The simple question to ask is, what would he gain, right? I mean, what does going to nuclear,
Hmm.
what does using nuclear weapons gain Putin? And the simple answer is that nothing. I mean, because
Nothing, sure.
he cannot, he not only will he not gain anything, he opens up potentially serious risk
Of course,
that there will be nuclear retaliation,
that's
right?
for
I mean, and
sure.
so
Yeah.
on. Yeah. So on the one hand, you have opening yourself up to an all sorts of uh, unforeseen damages, enormous amount of damage, um, because the risk that you're starting by going down that path.
Yeah.
But also the benefits are not clear. I mean, you can't sort of
Yeah.
force Kiev to surrender by using nuclear weapons.
Yeah, rationally
Um,
thinking that's true, but you
yeah.
never know.
So
You never know that
yeah,
how
you
much
never
impact.
know. This is the reason why it's, I think, needs to be taken seriously is that if I am wrong, the consequences are so horrendous, right? I mean,
Exactly.
so
Yeah,
so
sure.
it's a very minuscule probability, but high consequence.
Exactly.
And so that's a fair point. And so one shouldn't ever dismiss that. But I, and we have gone through various nuclear crises
Right. The Cuban
historically,
Missile Crisis is like the biggest one,
Cuban
probably.
Missile
That's like
Crisis and other
almost
ones also.
one button
So,
away, probably. Yeah.
yeah. And we know that leaders, there have been dangers even in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But leaders, if you look at the behavior of leaders, they have all been extremely cautious, and not just not just Cuban Missile Crisis, but other cases. Leaders tend to be very, very cautious when it comes to nuclear weapons,
Hmm.
because they know that they cannot behave even the way that they would otherwise when there are nuclear weapons involved,
Sure,
because
sure.
the dangers are so great. So I tend to be a little bit more optimistic about this particular aspect.
Hmm.
But like you said, I mean, we can
Hmm.
never, of course, rule out, because things could get out of hand.
Exactly.
So that is always a danger, but I think it's high consequence if something like that
That's for
happens,
sure.
but
That's for sure.
very, very low probability though. Yeah.
So, what are your views on India's response to this situation? So, thus far, at every UNSC council meeting, we have abstained from voting.
Yeah.
Several commentators, including yourself, have stated in the recent past that India's long-standing partnership with Russia is something that's overhyped much more than what it really stands for. And you have used history as well as the current economic equation to kind of justify the same. So, in the light of these arguments, what are your views on how India has responded this far?
I think we could have, like you said correctly, that I have been critical of the way we have responded. We don't need to have supported the West or anything like that, or condemned Russia or anything of that kind. But we could have, I think we have been unnecessarily and overly um, careful about not naming Russia, for example. I mean, there is no reason why we could not have named the Russian invasion. And we have seen that over time, it's kind of gotten harder and harder. The statements uh, became harder and harder. But the fact that we haven't named Russia, and some other resolutions, I don't understand why we abstained. For example, the resolution on the UN Security
Yeah,
Council decision to refer the matter to the General Assembly. Why there is
Right.
no reason
exactly.
why we should have
Exactly.
abstained from that. I mean, or even in the IAE and things like that. So I think we have been unnecessarily careful, unnecessarily not careful, but unnecessarily sort of worried about Russian reaction to our behavior. So I think that was a bit overdone. I don't think that was necessary. We didn't like I said, we did not have to need not have to come out and condemn Russia. I think Russian behavior was worthy of condemnation, but we could
Right.
say that okay, our national interest means that we don't go out and unnecessarily do things that get us into trouble. So fair enough. But it's also, I think, a larger problem that we haven't sort of looked at is how we got ourselves into this kind of a situation where we are so dependent on Russia for our weapons, which is what the general argument being that
Hmm.
is the reason why we have to be very careful, because 50 to 70%, nobody even seems to have a good sense of how much 50 to 70% of our arms that we have in different services come from Russia, and they all need servicing, they all need spare parts. And so all of that is potentially problematic if we have a war with China, if we don't keep Russia on our side. I mean, first, I don't understand how we ended up in a situation where such a huge quantity, such a huge proportion of our armory is sort of, given to one side, one country, so
Right.
that they always have a knife at our throat. So that itself is dangerous, and that itself is I don't understand why we ended up there. But it's also that my criticism is not so much about the present or about the justice or otherwise of the situation. It is more about the future. That is, um, going forward. Clearly, Russia is more and more beholden to China. The fight that they take with the West means that they are now in China's war. And our primary concern is China.
Mm.
So if we end up in a situation where we have to depend on a country that is dependent on China when we are fighting with China, I think that is putting ourselves at enormous risk. And so I think that is the reason that I'm more and more skeptical. I have been skeptical of this for a number of years. I've repeatedly written since 2014, actually, that India should reduce its dependence on Russia because of this, because of the fact that Russia is dependent on China, not because there's any other reason. I mean, it's not a,
Right.
in international politics, you don't have good guys and bad guys. It's just a
Exactly.
question of where your interests lie, and
Interesting.
our interest primarily is in being friendly with countries that can help us in dealing with our primary problem, which is China. And Russia is not that, right? I mean, and so for me, it becomes difficult to understand why we are in that, why we are in this position that we are in.
But
And if I could
can
see that, yeah, yeah,
can't
right,
Russia mediate? Let's say if a full-blown crisis breaks up between India and China, full-blown war, Russia
yeah,
can be a trusted intermediary because China trusts them, and if we have good relationship, right? Of course, America, China would never trust them to mediate.
yeah. No, but it's not mediation that we need when we have a problem with China, right? I mean, in the sense that even if we are would you trust a mediator who's dependent on one side,
Mhm.
right? If would that mediator be a would that mediator be truly neutral? Because
Mm.
given Russia's dependence on China, wouldn't China force Russia to do things that would support China? It has
Right,
happened before, right? And that's part of the problem. I think
right. Yes.
we tend to forget that in '62 this happened.
62. Yeah.
62 during the Sino-Indian War in '62, because the Soviet Union was going through the Cuban Missile Crisis, and even though the Sino-Soviet rift was already taking place, and Soviet Union had been taking somewhat more neutral position between India and China, the Sino-Soviet, the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, and the Soviets suddenly needed Chinese assistance, Chinese
Mm.
support, and so during those crucial 2 months of the war, the Soviets suddenly became neutral. I mean, went away from us. They started leaning towards China, and so because a significant part of India's strategy, Nehru's strategy, was based on the assumption that the Soviets would keep control over China, that they would sort of prevent China from attacking or from at least misbehaving. That suddenly went out of the window, and Soviets couldn't do anything. They had to support China. Of course, that stopped as soon as the Cuban Missile Crisis stopped, ended. The Soviets came back, but the problem was that by then it was too late, right? So that tells us something about the consequences of depending on a country which is itself dependent on somebody else, right? Especially our adversary. Excuse me. So I think that is a key problem. So if the country that you're depending on is
Mm.
dependent on your adversary,
Right.
and today it's much worse situation than the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuban Missile Crisis, Soviet Union was the elder partner. He now they are the junior partner. There's no
Right.
question about that, right? I mean, and so I'm not sure that that's a fair or a sensible position for India to be in, given the way things are evolving.
A couple of questions to end off. So, specifically for India, if you could probably, in brief, explain what should India's geopolitical strategy be? Because we are essentially in a bipolar world where you have one pole right next to us who is kind of adversarial, and you have the other pole which is in the US, but the US's track record in standing up for its allies in the recent past hasn't been exemplary. It's been far from exemplary. So how should our geopolitical strategy be? And if we could specifically focus on our defense strategy, because we are, as you mentioned correctly, dependent massively on Russia for our defense supplies. How can we
Yeah.
get out of such a weak spot?
Yeah. So I think overall, we are in this, we are emerging into a bipolar system, as you correctly pointed out. The US and China they are not peers they're not equal yet, but it's getting there. I mean,
In that,
and China is today a much more equal, uh, uh, has greater parity with the United States than the Soviet Union ever had during the Cold War days in economic terms, right? The Soviet
Mm.
Union during the Cold War days, I think that the highest point they reached in terms of percentage of the US economy was probably about 40% or 45% of the US economy. They never reached, they had never reached anywhere beyond that. I mean, so
right.
their economy is always less than half of the US economy. Of course, China's economy today is almost as big, and in some ways, if by purchasing power parity and so
PPP,
Bigger
on,
yeah,
than
exactly.
is
It's much
probably
bigger. Yeah,
bigger.
probably bigger than that, right? I
yeah.
mean, and so military terms, they are not, but military terms they're catching up very, very fast, even on naval terms. They are the only country other than the United States that has two stealth fifth generation fighter programs, going on. The only two countries in the world that have two fifth generation fighter planes flying, and that's the United States and China, right? I mean, and so they are building their next aircraft carrier is going to be as big as at about 110,000 or 120,000 tons displacement. I think it's going to be it's about the same size as the latest US super carriers. So, I mean, every which way you look at it, their military power is they're in another 10 years, they're going to be almost as powerful as almost a match for the United States. And of course, that's why they're also suddenly seem to be ramping up their nuclear size of their nuclear arsenal, because that's the one area where they had by choice, not because they couldn't, but by choice they had kept it very limited. And now over the last 1 year, we have seen that they're suddenly ramping it up, and it seems to me that they are planning to achieve parity there also, which means basically that they will have achieved parity in economic terms, in conventional military terms, and in nuclear terms. And so the other area is, of course, in terms of overall global reach, and they're now beginning to have military basing facilities in other continents, in Africa, Djibouti, and a place like that. So that will also happen over the next 10 years or so. So we are looking, and there's nobody even close to these two, right? These two are the giants. The next biggest power, next wealthiest country is what? If you leave out European Union, it is Japan. I think probably about $6 trillion or something,
Right.
whereas they are about close to $20 trillion in exchange rate terms. We are about $3 trillion. So less than that. But so we are. Those two are alone in the mountaintop, as it were, and so that it's going to be bipolar. It's not going to be multipolar. And unfortunately, I keep seeing our foreign ministry and leaders keep talking about multipolarity, and I don't know what they're thinking about, but it's not a multipolar, and it's not going to be multipolar world for the foreseeable future.
Possible future.
So we have to sort of get used to the fact that it's going to be bipolar. And the other problem, as you correctly pointed out, is one of the bipolar powers is our neighbor with which we have difficulties. Now, even if we did not have difficulties, even if we did not have territorial problems, the fact that we are next to one of the two bipolar powers would automatically, make us wary of that power, because obviously they will try to seek control over their own border areas and their own neighborhood and their own region, and so that we would come under their thumb, as it were, and so we would have to worry about it. But this is a country that with which we have territorial disputes on top of everything else, right? I mean, and so to me, it is fairly clear that given these conditions, we cannot align with China. So that leaves us only the United States, and the United States primarily because there is no country in the world today that can balance or counter China other than the United States. right? I mean, it's not, we don't have very many choices. So I keep hearing people talking about, it's France and Germany and, Japan. And even if you put all of these together, they're no match for China. Forget about, even together, we are no match for China. So without the United States, any effort to counter China or to protect ourselves will not work. It's that simple. Right? I mean, and we can put up a defense. Our ground forces are fairly capable. They're large. They can maybe give a tough fight in the Himalayas. But then we are only looking at, well, if you're looking at the potential of a two-front war. One of the lessons of the current crisis is that Belarus and Russia together is that in the future, we have already been worried about that. But would China learn that lesson? That bring Pakistan into it, either directly or indirectly. If all Pakistan has to do in the context of a conflict, of an Indian conflict with China, is just move some forces to the border. That will automatically, immediately tie down our forces on the west.
Right.
Will not be able to move it to the east, right? I mean, they don't even have to attack us. All they have to do, half of our air force will have to be deployed to make sure that Pakistan doesn't start anything. So that's all it takes. And of course, it's not just two-front war. Another 5 years from now, China's carrier battle groups will start patrolling into the Bay of Bengal and the Indian Ocean. So we are looking at a three-front war, right? I mean, we are looking at the potential of a three-front, at least if not a war, at least a three-front challenge. And we cannot match that. I mean, we can at best match them on the northern border. We cannot match them if it is a two-front problem, or definitely not on a three-front problem. So we have to coordinate our efforts with others, and only other one that we can do that is with the United States and its partners, Japan and Australia and Quad and other countries. So in a sense, we don't have too many options. Given the challenges that we face, China is already like 5 times our size in terms of economic wealth, and their defense budget is ramping up quite a bit. So we need to coordinate with others who we don't have to align. We don't. So the fact that the US is not dependable, nobody is dependable. We are hardly dependable, right? I mean, dependability is not something that we look for in international politics. The reason we will cooperate with them, or that we should cooperate with them, is not because they're dependable, but because on this one issue, at least for the time being, for the next few decades, couple of decades at least, our interests coincide. That's all.
Sure.
I mean, a couple of decades from now, our interests may not coincide. If tomorrow China collapses for whatever reason, then again our interests may not coincide with the United States, right? I mean, so under this current condition, under this current circumstance, our interests coincide. And so that is the only reason. Not about US is not going to come and fight for us in the Himalayas, and we don't want them either, right? I mean, but it is that we can divide the burden in dealing with the fundamental problem that we face, which is China. So that is the only reason for cooperating with the United States. And it's not a legal contract. I mean, if it doesn't suit us, we can always walk out. I mean, it's Pakistan.
But given the physical position that we have, like all these countries are so far away from us, and China is just next door. Like, isn't it a better strategy to sort of mitigate on the Chinese front rather than aligning with these forces, which might increase the animosity with Chinese?
We have tried that, and we have tried that since the city. We have tried that, and we got nowhere. Secondly, we may not have any other choice after a point of time. If, for example, let's say the US, for domestic political reasons, it decides that it wants to go back to isolation, or it's not interested in helping India, or whatever, or it becomes too weak to help India. So at that point, we may need to go back to that. That's in international politics, we call it bandwagoning, which is that we may have to bandwagon with China. We may have to basically kowtow to China, right? I mean, that may be a strategy at some point of time. And we can't sort of, appeasement is a legitimate strategy, right? It is not, it has got some negative connotations because of Hitler and whatnot, but it is a legitimate strategy. Absolutely. But it is a legitimate strategy. If you are a weak country, if you're a relatively weak country, you have to do what you need to do to survive.
Protect the citizens, rather
absolutely. So that's a legitimate strategy when you have no other choice. But it is, at this point, we do have a choice. And so at this point, balancing or countering China is a better choice than kowtowing or bandwagoning with China. So that's the only reason I would suggest that, and of course we have tried the other part, even all the Wuhan summit and the
Right, right.
Mahabalipuram summit. We tried even after the Doklam crisis. We tried, but it didn't work. And so, if China were even slightly smart, they would recognize that they could have India as a friend and didn't have to worry about about their Western front. And so that especially given that they have problems on the Taiwan side and on the Pacific, but this for some reason they don't seem to be interested, and so we have to take that into consideration.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
So, to end off, sir, we usually ask academics this question. So if you could probably end off with a couple of recommendations of commentators or books that you feel would benefit our readers in understanding the current Ukraine-Russia crisis and its wider geopolitical implications.
Or the overall geopolitical situations currently.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, since Mearsheimer, we have talked a lot about Mearsheimer. The most prominent book that he has is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. His more recent book is called The Great Delusion, even though many of his arguments here in the later book is somewhat contradicts the earlier work. But I teach I teach both of them, but I think the earlier book is more of a theory. I think it's definitely absolutely worth reading. It's also central to understanding some of the problems that we are facing, especially because the most recent edition, I think, also has a section on China and the problems of US and China in the emerging order. And I think it's an easy read. I mean, it's not a complicated social science kind of a book. It uses social science theory, but it uses it in a manner that is easy to understand. I don't agree with Mearsheimer on everything, but I think it's probably it's a book that I would sort of definitely recommend. The other book, not a book, but articles, I would recommend some of the works by William Wolforth, who is again a political science professor in the US. And he's done a lot of work. He was originally a Sovietologist and then a Russia specialist, but also a specialist on international relations theory. He has, in particular, I would sort of recommend a book that he co-edited with a number of other scholars called The Balance of Power in World History, which is very interesting because it sort of looks at how the ideas of balance of power and how balance of power itself has operated throughout history. Because one of the things that we find in a lot of Western writing is that they focus entirely on Europe and look at only at European balance of power, especially in the last 500 years or so after the end of the Roman Empire.
Right.
They don't. So this one looks actually at across different spaces and different times. India, East Asia, Middle East, and so it looks at different cases, and it also makes a very interesting argument about the fact that often balance of power does not work. I think that's the second book that I would. It's slightly more social sciencey, but it's still not that difficult to read. So I would definitely recommend that also. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir, for being very patient with your responses, and thank you so much, sir, for so much time of yours. This session was very, very illuminating, and I'm sure our listeners/viewers would also immensely cherish it. Thank you so much, sir. Stay safe.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot.